The act of raising a cane against an elderly man is already an unforgivable cruelty, but when that man is someone who has carried the weight of a nation's battles on his shoulders, the offense takes on a darkness that words can barely contain. An old man, frail in body but unbroken in spirit, stood as the target of senseless rage from a woman who thrived on control and arrogance. To Karen, he was nothing more than another neighbor to dominate, another life to belittle under her iron grip as head of the HOA. She saw the wrinkles on his skin as weakness, his slow steps as incompetence, his silence as submission. But she was blind to the truth. This was no ordinary man. This was someone who had braved battlefields where every breath could have been his last, someone who had survived nights filled with the sound of gunfire and days painted in sacrifice. The cane that struck him was not just an insult to his age, but a disgrace to his history, a history built on courage that entitled bullies like Karen could never understand. Every lash of her cruelty carried the weight of disrespect not only to him, but to the sacrifices of countless others who had worn the uniform with pride. What she believed was an act of dominance would soon be revealed as her greatest mistake, for the man she sought to humiliate was once a decorated war hero whose silent strength held stories more powerful than any weapon she could ever wield. And when that truth came to light, her arrogance would shatter, her power would crumble, and the entire community would learn that attacking dignity born from sacrifice is the one act that will never be forgiven. Strength is often misunderstood. Many believe it to be about loud voices, dominating presences, or a show of physical power. But my father embodied a different kind of strength, the kind that spoke softly, carried itself with humility, and left an impression without ever demanding attention. He was the kind of man who never had to raise his voice to be heard. His very presence commanded respect, not through fear, but through the quiet dignity he carried into every room he entered. People would notice the way he held himself, shoulders squared despite his age, eyes calm yet alert, as though a lifetime of battles had trained him to remain steady no matter the storm. He had lived through decades of experiences most people couldn't even imagine. Once upon a time, he had been a soldier. Not just any soldier, but a decorated veteran who had walked through the darkest corners of war and returned with medals that told stories of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Yet he never flaunted those medals, never sought recognition, and never boasted about the battles he had survived. His stories of war remained locked in his memory, revealed only in fragments, like tiny windows into a past that had shaped him but never consumed him. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, he was simply an elderly man who spent his mornings in the garden, carefully tending to the flowers that gave him peace. But to us, his family, he was the embodiment of resilience, a man who had fought for life and freedom and then chosen to live with grace. Growing up, I often marveled at the balance he carried. He had seen the worst humanity had to offer, yet he never allowed bitterness to take root in his heart. Instead, he cultivated patience. He knew how to listen when others were quick to argue, how to forgive when others clung to grudges, and how to stay calm even when provoked. His silence was not weakness but wisdom, a reminder that not every battle was worth fighting. He believed true strength lay in knowing when to stand tall and when to walk away. This philosophy made him a pillar not only in our family, but also in the community, a man people turned to for advice, for comfort, for stability. What made his quiet strength even more extraordinary was the love and respect he extended to others, no matter their background. He treated neighbors with kindness, helped struggling families without ever expecting recognition, and found joy in the smallest gestures of gratitude. Even as age slowed his steps, it never dimmed his spirit. Watching him lean on his cane was not a sign of frailty, but a symbol of endurance, for behind that cane was a man who had once marched across battlefields and returned home with unshakable resolve. His cane carried more than his weight. It carried decades of stories, lessons, and sacrifices that made him who he was. And yet, this strength was invisible to those blinded by arrogance. To Karen, the head of the HOA, he was merely an old man who could be pushed aside, dismissed, or even humiliated. She saw only the surface, the wrinkles, the slowing steps, the quiet demeanor. She mistook his humility for weakness and his silence for submission. What she failed to understand was that true heroes rarely announce themselves. My father did not need to remind anyone of who he was or what he had endured, because his character was enough. His life had already spoken louder than words ever could. To us, he was a symbol of pride. To Karen, he was a target. And it was in this dangerous misunderstanding, this blindness to quiet strength, that her downfall would be written. For my father's dignity, born from sacrifice and sustained by resilience, was not something any cane, insult, or petty tyrant could ever break. She could strike at his body, but she could never touch the core of who he was. And when the truth of his past came into the light, when the community finally saw the depth of the man she had dared to attack, her cruelty would not only be exposed but forever condemned. Power is an intoxicating thing, and in the hands of the wrong person, it becomes destructive. For Karen, control was more than a position, it was an addiction. She had convinced herself that the neighborhood existed for her authority alone, and the HOA was her throne. While most people treated their roles in homeowners associations as a way to maintain harmony, fairness, and upkeep, Karen weaponized it into a tool for domination. Rules that were meant to bring neighbors together became chains she used to restrict, punish, and humiliate anyone who dared to cross her. She wasn't interested in fairness, she was obsessed with control. Karen's reign began subtly, almost deceptively. At first, she hid behind the language of improvement and community standards. She demanded that lawns be cut no longer than 2 inches, fences be painted only in approved colors, and decorations be removed if they didn't fit her personal taste. Many went along, thinking she was simply organized or committed, but over time, her demands grew sharper, her tone more threatening. She issued fines for trivial reasons, wrote letters dripping with condescension, and patrolled the neighborhood as if she were a self-appointed sheriff. People stopped seeing her as a neighbor and began seeing her as a tyrant. What made Karen's control so venomous was the way she targeted those she believed were weakest. Families who struggled financially, newcomers who didn't know the unwritten rules, elderly residents who couldn't keep up with her relentless demands, these became her favorite prey. She thrived on their discomfort, gaining satisfaction from watching others scramble to appease her. She wasn't simply maintaining order, she was feeding her ego by reminding everyone that she held the power to disrupt their lives at will. To Karen, the HOA wasn't a responsibility, it was a weapon, and she wielded it with cruelty. My father quickly became one of her favorite targets. To her, he was an easy mark. His garden, though beautiful, didn't always conform to her exact specifications. She complained about the size of his flag, about the way he placed his trash cans, about the flowers he planted outside his home. She used every minor detail as ammunition, turning what should have been simple neighborhood interactions into opportunities for humiliation. Each time she approached him, it wasn't to resolve an issue but to assert dominance. And each time he responded with calmness, her frustration grew. She mistook his patience as weakness, never realizing that his silence was not surrender but restraint. Karen's obsession with control didn't stop at issuing complaints. She thrived on public embarrassment. HOA meetings became her stage, and she relished the opportunity to call out her neighbors in front of others. My father, despite his quiet dignity, was not spared. She ridiculed him for being too old to maintain his property, questioned whether he was fit to live independently, and openly suggested that he was bringing down the neighborhood's image. The cruelty of her words cut deeper than any fine or penalty. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about tearing down a man who carried himself with grace. The irony was staggering. Karen believed herself to be powerful because she could write letters and issue penalties, but she had no idea of the man she was facing. She thought she was attacking weakness, but she was actually clashing with a fortress of resilience built over decades of sacrifice and survival. Her arrogance blinded her to the reality that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly unshaken, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The more she failed to break my father, the more obsessive she became. Her visits to his home grew more frequent, her criticisms more venomous. She began involving others, spreading whispers about how he was difficult or noncompliant. She wanted to isolate him, to make him feel small, to remind him that in her world, she was the authority. But what Karen didn't understand was that respect can never be forced, and the fear she used as a weapon was beginning to turn against her. Neighbors, once silent, started noticing her patterns. They saw how she singled him out, how her rules seemed harsher for him than for others. They began questioning her motives, though few were brave enough to speak up. Yet, Karen thrived on control, but her control was fragile. It was built on fear, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would challenge her. She had no idea that the man she was tormenting was someone who had faced challenges far greater than an HOA bully. My father had once endured situations where a single wrong step meant death, where courage meant more than comfort, and where leadership wasn't about issuing fines but about saving lives. Compared to the storms he had weathered, Karen's fury was nothing but a passing gust of wind. Still, the danger of obsession is that it never stops escalating. For Karen, my father's quiet resilience became an insult, a challenge she couldn't ignore. She wanted submission, and she wasn't going to rest until she got it. What she didn't know was that her obsession was leading her toward a breaking point, one where her need for control would drive her into making the biggest mistake of her life, one that would not only expose her cruelty, but also unravel the empire of fear she had built. Because power built on arrogance always crumbles when it meets dignity built on sacrifice. And when that moment came, the neighborhood would no longer see Karen as the authority. They would see her for what she truly was, a bully consumed by her own obsession. Every storm begins with a single gust of wind, and with Karen, the storm had been brewing for months. Her obsession with control, her relentless pursuit of domination, and her constant targeting of my father had pushed the tension in the neighborhood to a boiling point. Neighbors had grown used to the sharp sound of her voice, the endless complaints, and the venom in her words. But on that fateful day, her cruelty crossed a line that could never be erased. It began with something small, as it often did with her. A flag that flew slightly higher than her arbitrary measurements allowed, a flower bed that stretched an inch beyond her imagined boundary, or perhaps simply the sight of my father standing with his quiet dignity, unmoved by her constant harassment. To her, these things weren't minor. They were personal insults, challenges to her authority. That morning, she arrived angrier than ever, clutching her cane not as a tool for balance, but as a weapon of frustration. Her words, sharp as knives, lashed out at him, accusing him of disrespecting the neighborhood, of defying her authority, of refusing to fall in line. My father, as he always did, met her fury with calm. He did not shout back. He did not cower. He stood there, leaning slightly on his own cane, eyes steady, his silence carrying more power than any defense he could have spoken. And that silence was what shattered her. Karen, who thrived on provoking reactions, who fed on fear and submission, found herself powerless against a man who refused to give her what she craved. It enraged her. The control she believed she had was slipping through her fingers, and in that moment her obsession consumed her. Then came the breaking point. In a sudden burst of rage, she lifted her cane and struck. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, a shocking crack that cut through the air and silenced everything around. Neighbors who had gathered, whether out of curiosity or habit, froze in disbelief. The sight of a woman attacking an elderly man with such cruelty was almost too surreal to comprehend. But it happened, and with each strike, Karen revealed not power, but the ugliness of her soul. My father did not retaliate. His body staggered under the blows, his cane barely holding him steady, yet his spirit did not falter. In his silence was defiance. In his endurance was victory. To the crowd, It became clear that this was no fight between equals. This was an act of unprovoked violence, an assault born of arrogance and hate. The neighborhood, long silent under Karen's rule, finally saw her without disguise. She was no leader, no protector of standards, no keeper of order. She was a bully exposed for what she truly was. What made the moment even more haunting was the contrast between the two figures. Karen, consumed by rage, her face twisted with the need to dominate, her strikes filled with desperation. And my father, calm, dignified, battered but unbroken, a man whose silence carried more power than her violence ever could. For years, she had believed herself to be the strongest voice in the neighborhood. But that day, strength revealed its true form, not in the hand that struck, but in the spirit that endured. The crowd's shock quickly turned to outrage. Whispers grew into gasps, gasps into shouts. Some rushed forward to intervene, pulling Karen back, demanding she stop. Others rushed to my father's side, their eyes wide with horror, their voices trembling with guilt for not speaking up sooner. In that single violent act, Karen destroyed the illusion of authority she had built. Her reputation, her control, her carefully crafted image as the enforcer of order, all of it crumbled. And yet, even as he steadied himself after the assault, my father did not speak a word against her. He did not raise his hand, did not curse, did not allow himself to be dragged into the ugliness of her rage. His composure in the face of violence was more powerful than any retaliation could have been. To the neighbors watching, that moment became unforgettable. For the first time, they began to see him not as just another elderly resident, but as something far greater. What Karen had failed to realize was that by striking him, she had struck against something larger than herself. She had assaulted not just a man, but the dignity of someone who had once fought for freedoms she took for granted. She had attacked not weakness, but resilience. And while she may have believed her blows proved her dominance, they instead marked the beginning of her downfall. That breaking point became a turning point. The neighborhood, once fearful of her, was now united in disgust. People who had whispered their disapproval behind closed doors finally spoke openly. They saw the injustice for what it was, and they could no longer ignore it. Karen's violence had done what years of complaints and fines could not. It had exposed her tyranny to the light. And soon, the truth about my father, the truth Karen had been blind to all along, would come to the surface. Her attack had not just harmed an elderly man, it had disrespected a war hero, a man whose quiet strength carried stories of sacrifice that no one in the neighborhood had ever imagined. And when that truth spread, Karen's fall from power would be swift, merciless, and complete. Because arrogance may win battles in silence, but dignity always wins wars when the truth is revealed. Sometimes the weight of truth is heavier than any weapon, and when it finally reveals itself, it shatters illusions in ways no argument ever could. After the attack, the neighborhood buzzed with disbelief and outrage. People who had once looked away from Karen's antics found themselves forced to confront what they had witnessed with their own eyes. The sight of an elderly man struck down by a woman's cane was not something they could excuse or dismiss. It was brutality, plain and undeniable. But what they still didn't know was who exactly they had seen standing silently beneath her blows. They knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself, who tended his garden and waved politely. They didn't yet understand the depth of his story. The truth came out slowly at first, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across the floor. Someone mentioned seeing the medals displayed in his study during a holiday gathering years back. Another neighbor recalled overhearing whispers that he had served overseas. Whispers turned into questions, and questions turned into revelations. When family members, friends, and even fellow veterans spoke, the story of my father's past began to unfold. He wasn't just an elderly man with a cane. He was a decorated war hero who had once stood on the front lines of battles most people only read about in history books. His service record was not just long, it was distinguished. He had been awarded medals for bravery under fire, for saving lives at great personal risk, and for leading others through chaos when the odds were stacked against them. He had endured nights when the sky lit up with fire and days when hope seemed like a luxury. He had walked away from those battlefields carrying scars he never showed and memories he rarely spoke of. His silence had not been emptiness, it had been humility. He had chosen to live his life quietly, never using his past as a shield, never demanding recognition, never seeking applause. For the neighbors, the realization was overwhelming. They had allowed Karen's cruelty to go unchecked, thinking my father was just another vulnerable target. Now, confronted with the truth, guilt settled heavy in their hearts. Many began to approach our family with tears in their eyes, apologizing for not standing up sooner, for allowing arrogance to overshadow respect. Some veterans in the community came forward, saluting him, sharing their own stories of service, and acknowledging the brotherhood that only those who have faced war can truly understand. For the first time, the neighborhood saw him for who he really was, a man of honor, dignity, and unshakable strength. Karen, on the other hand, found herself in the center of a storm she could not escape. Her attack was no longer seen as just an act of neighborly cruelty, it was now viewed as an act of disgrace against a man who had fought for the very freedom she enjoyed. The narrative shifted completely. Where once her voice had been the loudest in HOA meetings, now it was drowned out by a chorus of voices condemning her actions. The same neighbors she had intimidated into silence were now emboldened by the truth, unwilling to let her hide behind rules and regulations. The exposure of my father's past became more than just a story, it became a symbol. It was a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who serve, of the quiet heroes who live among us, unnoticed until moments of truth bring their legacies to light. It was also a reckoning for Karen, who had built her identity on the illusion of power. By attacking my father, she had unknowingly struck at the heart of something much larger than herself, the respect owed to those who had given everything for their country. What made the revelation even more powerful was the way my father responded. He never used his military service to shame Karen, never raised his voice in anger, never demanded recognition. Instead, he carried himself as he always had, with humility. When asked about his medals, he brushed off the praise, saying only that he had done what needed to be done. When others tried to elevate him, he redirected their admiration to the many men and women who had fought alongside him, some of whom had never returned home. Even in the face of violence and humiliation, his focus remained not on himself, but on the values he had lived by: duty, honor, and resilience. That humility was what silenced Karen more effectively than any punishment ever could. She had tried to break a man she thought was weak, only to discover that she had struck against someone unbreakable. She had tried to humiliate him, only to humiliate herself before the entire community. And as the truth spread beyond the neighborhood, to local veterans organizations, to community leaders, even to the press, Karen's reputation became a stain she could never wash away. The truth had come out, and with it, justice began to take shape. For the first time in years, the neighborhood no longer looked at Karen with fear. They looked at her with disdain, with anger, with a determination to hold her accountable. And they looked at my father not as a victim, but as a symbol of quiet strength, a man who had carried burdens none of them could imagine and yet still chose to live in peace. The story of his life, once hidden in silence, was now illuminated by the cruelty of one woman's arrogance. And though Karen had sought to control and dominate, she had instead unlocked the truth that would destroy her authority forever. Because truth, once revealed, has a power no bully can ever overcome. The moment the truth about my father's past spread through the neighborhood, the balance of power shifted in a way Karen could never have imagined. For years she had ruled through fear, her sharp words and relentless fines silencing even those who despised her. But now, the community's silence was broken. Her cruelty had gone too far, and for the first time, neighbors who once bowed their heads were ready to raise their voices. The HOA meetings, once dominated by Karen's tirades, became scenes of confrontation. Instead of nodding along with her endless complaints, people began questioning her authority. They asked why she had targeted my father so relentlessly, why she had taken rules meant for order and twisted them into weapons. Her attempts to justify herself, claiming he was non-compliant, that she was only upholding standards, fell flat. The room was no longer hers to command. Faces that once looked fearful now glared back with anger. Every word she spoke dug her deeper into a pit of shame she could not escape. Neighbors who had witnessed the assault stepped forward, recounting the violence they had seen with their own eyes. Their voices, trembling at first, grew stronger as others joined in, confirming the pattern of harassment and abuse she had inflicted not only on my father, but on many others. Families revealed how she had fined them over trivialities, how she had threatened legal action over harmless mistakes, how she had used her position to intimidate rather than to serve. Each testimony stripped away the facade of authority she had built, exposing the cruelty that lay beneath. As the stories poured out, the community's mood shifted from anger to resolve. People began organizing petitions to remove her from her position. Longtime residents, some of whom had once been her allies, withdrew their support and demanded accountability. Even those who had remained neutral in the past could no longer deny what had become obvious. Karen's leadership was not leadership at all, it was tyranny. And tyranny, once exposed, cannot stand. Outside the meetings, the shift was even more visible. Neighbors who had once avoided one another out of fear of drawing her wrath began to connect. Conversations sparked in driveways, on sidewalks, at the community park. People shared their frustrations openly, uniting in a way that hadn't been possible before. The act of standing together against her became a kind of healing for the community, a reclamation of the unity she had destroyed. My father, though he never sought the spotlight, became the quiet symbol of that change. His dignity in the face of her violence inspired others to stand firm as well. Karen, however, did not give up easily. She lashed out with the same venom she always had, but now her words carried no weight. When she tried to issue fines, people refused to pay. When she tried to intimidate, they stood their ground. When she tried to shame others in public, she was the one who ended up humiliated. Her power had evaporated, and all she had left was the bitterness that had defined her from the start. She was no longer the feared enforcer of rules, but a neighbor despised, pitted, and rejected by those she once controlled. The ultimate blow came when the HOA board, pressured by the overwhelming voice of the community, called for her removal. The same position she had used as a throne was stripped from her hands. The title she clung to so desperately was gone, replaced by the reality that no one respected her anymore. For someone like Karen, whose entire identity was built on domination, the loss was unbearable. Her arrogance crumbled into desperation, but no apology could undo what she had done. The image of her striking an elderly veteran had been burned into the minds of everyone, a reminder of the cruelty she was capable of. For my father, the shift was bittersweet. He never wanted to be the reason for conflict, never wanted the community to divide or fight. But as he looked around at the unity that had been forged in the wake of her downfall, he understood that sometimes it takes a single act of injustice to awaken people to the truth. His quiet strength had sparked something larger, the courage for an entire neighborhood to stand together. Karen's downfall was not just her own, it was the community's redemption. The fear that had gripped everyone for so long was gone, replaced by solidarity and a renewed sense of respect. And though scars of her reign remained, they were no longer wounds that festered in silence. They became lessons, reminders of what happens when power is abused and of the responsibility people have to stand against injustice. In the end, Karen was left with nothing but the ruins of the empire she had built on arrogance. And my father, the man she had tried to break, stood taller than ever, not in body, but in spirit. For in exposing her cruelty, he had reminded everyone what true strength looks like. Justice does not always come swiftly, but when it arrives, it carries a weight that restores balance where cruelty once reigned. After the community turned against Karen and stripped her of her power within the HOA, many thought the chapter was closed. But for my father, and for those who had watched the violence unfold, there was still unfinished business. An attack like the one Karen carried out could not simply be forgotten, nor should it be. The law, too, had to have its say. The assault report was filed, supported by the testimonies of neighbors who had witnessed every strike of her cane. For years, many had feared speaking against Karen, but now their voices rose with clarity and conviction. What had once been whispers behind closed doors became statements in front of authorities. The truth, undeniable and raw, left no room for Karen to twist the narrative in her favor. She had built her reputation on intimidation, but the law was not intimidated by arrogance. When the evidence was gathered, it painted a damning picture. An elderly veteran attacked without provocation, his only crime being that he refused to bend to her bullying. In court, Karen tried to defend herself. She spoke of rules, of standards, of her supposed responsibility to uphold order. But every excuse sounded hollow. The judge listened patiently, then turned to the witnesses, men, women, and even children who had seen the event unfold. Their accounts aligned perfectly, a chorus of truth that drowned out Karen's lies. When the details of my father's decorated service were presented, the room fell into reverent silence. The medals, the commendations, the sacrifices, they were not weapons used to shame Karen, but reminders of the dignity of the man she had assaulted. And in that moment, even the law seemed to bow its head in respect. The verdict was clear. Karen was found guilty of assault and sentenced accordingly. The penalties were not just financial, but reputational. Her name became synonymous with cruelty in the community and beyond. Where she had once strutted through the neighborhood with authority, now she avoided eye contact, her presence reduced to whispers of contempt. She had lost not only her title and her power, but also the illusion of respect she had clung to so desperately. For my father, justice was never about revenge. He did not smile at her downfall, nor did he gloat in her humiliation. Instead, he remained the same man he had always been, steady, humble, and dignified. When asked how he felt about the outcome, he simply said that it was not about him, but about making sure no one else would suffer the same cruelty again. His focus was never on punishment, but on protection, the same instinct that had guided him as a soldier now guiding him as a man at peace. The redemption that followed was not Karen's, but the community's. Freed from her grip, the neighborhood began to heal. People who had once kept to themselves out of fear now connected openly. Small acts of kindness replaced the suspicion she had sown. Neighbors helped one another with repairs, shared meals, and organized gatherings without the shadow of her interference. My father, though reluctant to accept praise, became a quiet figure of inspiration. Children who once only saw him as the old man with a cane now listened wide-eyed as he shared gentle lessons about respect, patience, and courage. Veterans visited, shaking his hand with gratitude, recognizing in him a brother who had carried the same weight they had. Karen's absence was not just noticed, it was celebrated. The community meetings, once tense and filled with her venom, became places of true collaboration. Decisions were made with fairness, not fear. And in that shift, people realized that they had always had the power to stand together. They had simply been too afraid to use it. Karen's downfall became the spark that lit a fire of unity. In the quiet after the storm, my father often sat on his porch, cane resting at his side, watching the neighborhood with the same calm he always had. To him, life had simply continued. To us, it was clear that something profound had changed. His resilience had not only withstood Karen's cruelty, but had transformed an entire community. His dignity had reminded people that strength is not in domination, but in endurance. His silence had spoken louder than her shouting ever could. And as Karen faded into the background, forgotten and disgraced, my father's legacy endured. Justice had been served, but more importantly, respect had been restored. The story was no longer about a cruel woman's obsession with control. It was about the redemption of a community that had learned, through one man's quiet strength, what it truly meant to stand together. Some stories leave us shaken, others inspire us. But the ones that matter most are those that remind us of the values we should never forget: dignity, courage, and respect. What happened to my father was not just an attack on an elderly man, it was an assault on everything he represented: his quiet endurance, his refusal to be broken, and his unshakable dignity turned cruelty into a lesson for all of us. In a world where arrogance often masquerades as strength, his story proves that true power lies in patience, humility, and sacrifice. Karen thought she could wield control with fear, but fear always crumbles when confronted by integrity. Her downfall was inevitable because cruelty cannot stand against character built through years of sacrifice. And while her name has faded into disgrace, my father's legacy has grown stronger, becoming a beacon of what it means to stand tall even when the world tries to push you down. His story belongs not only to our family, but to everyone who has ever faced injustice and chosen to meet it with courage instead of surrender. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the kind of strength we should honor and the kind of cruelty we must always stand against, then don't let it end here. Join us on this journey of powerful stories that expose arrogance, highlight resilience, and remind us of the values worth fighting for. Subscribe to the HOA stories so you never miss the next tale of justice, strength, and redemption. Because every story shared here is more than entertainment. It's a reminder that dignity will always rise above cruelty.